The Gen Z Maandamano protests in Kenya, sparked by the 2024 Finance Bill, were a defining moment for public opinion of Kenyan influencers and public figures. The public's perception, particularly among the youth-led movement, was largely shaped by whether these figures vocally supported the protests or remained silent. Those who spoke out in favor of the demonstrations were seen as allies, while those who were perceived as silent, pro-government, or even outright opposed to the movement faced significant backlash. For every loved public figure during the Gen Z protests, there was a hated one regarding their stance on the finance bill. I am Liozaresa. I do investigative reports. Like and subscribe for more videos like this. Starting with the top ranking in Kenya, the figure who became the flashpoint for all the anger was none other than President William Ruto. Just 2 years after campaigning as a hustler who would uplift the common Kenyan, he found himself facing a youth movement that saw his administration as the primary source of their pain. The public's intense hatred was a direct result of his administration's signature legislation, the Finance Bill 2024. For the protesters, who had already been promised relief from a high cost of living, the proposed taxes on bread, motor vehicles, and even sanitary pads felt like a profound betrayal. His initial hardline stance, where he insisted the taxes were necessary to reduce debt, was viewed as a tone-deaf and arrogant position. The protesters, in a powerful act of ridicule, began calling him Zakayo, a reference to the biblical tax collector Zacchaeus, transforming his name into a symbol of greed and oppression. But the hatred went deeper than just tax policy. It was fueled by the government's violent response to the protests. As the demonstrations grew, so did the use of force. When protesters, many of them young and unarmed, were met with live bullets, tear gas, and abductions, the public rage boiled over. The tragic loss of life became a direct indictment of the administration's actions. President Ruto's initial response to the violence, which included deploying the military and labeling the protesters as criminals.
It is not in order or even conceivable that criminals pretending to be peaceful protesters can rain terror against the people.
Was seen not as a leader's plea for peace, but as an aggressive declaration of war on his own people. In the end, facing unprecedented pressure from both the streets and the international community, President Ruto conceded. He announced that he would not sign the bill into law and acknowledged that the people have spoken.
I concede, and therefore I will not sign the 2024 Finance Bill.
However, for many, this was too little too late. The bloodshed and the initial hardline position had already left an indelible mark, solidifying his place as the most hated figure during a revolution that forever changed Kenya's political landscape. Activist Boniface Mwangi became a revered figure, a bridge between generations. For the young protesters on the street, he was not just a supporter, he was a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of what sustained and fearless activism looks like. His love from the Gen Z movement was forged not in a single moment, but in a long history of putting his life on the line for justice. Decades ago, as a young photojournalist, he documented the brutal reality of Kenya's 2007 post-election violence. This experience turned him from a passive observer into an unrelenting activist. When the Gen Z protests erupted, he brought that veteran's wisdom to the streets, sharing his knowledge on how to protest safely, how to document human rights abuses, and how to hold power accountable. He led protests against unlawful arrests of demonstrators, unlawful abductions, and extrajudicial unaliving of protesters. He was also vocal on his social media accounts on the injustices of President Ruto's regime. One thing that made the Gen Z love him most, he was at the forefront of the protests, not afraid of the tear gas or water cannons, holding a model depicting the president and MPs as greedy pig dummies. He was also arrested during the protests while leading demonstrators marching to demand justice. For decades, the name Raila Odinga has been synonymous with political protests in Kenya. A veteran of the struggle, he has led countless maandamanos against past governments, earning him an iconic status as a defender of the people. So when a new youth-led revolution erupted against the finance bill, many expected him to be at its helm, but what they got instead was a complicated silence. Initially, Raila's stance on the bill was mixed. His party, the Azimio coalition, was officially against it. and his MPs voted no. He himself released statements criticizing the proposed taxes as insensitive and callous. However, the public noted his uncharacteristic absence from the streets. For a man whose political identity was forged in defiance, his decision to not physically join the protest was jarring. Many in the Gen Z movement, who are used to his calls for Maandamano, felt he was a no-show, leaving them to face the police brutality alone. This perceived silence was widely interpreted as a symptom of his new political ambitions. Having launched a bid for the chairmanship of the African Union Commission, many speculated that he was hesitant to be seen as an agitator in his own country. He had to be careful not to alienate governments that would vote on his candidacy. This led to a new narrative among the youth that Raila had been bought or had betrayed his history for a shot at international power. The very man who had taught a generation how to protest was now being seen as a cautious spectator, watching from the sidelines. It was only after the tragic loss of life and the occupation of parliament that Raila's voice became more assertive. He condemned the police brutality and called for justice for the victims. He later advocated for compensation for the families of those who had died. However, for many, the damage was already done. The protests were a leaderless movement by design, and the youth had made it clear they did not need a political patron. In the end, Raila's legacy as a protest hero remained intact for a previous generation. But for the Gen Z, the protests were not about him. They had found their own voice, and in the process, they had placed him in a complicated category. No longer a hated enemy, but a loved hero who had just lost his moment. The situation changed after the protests when Raila was often seen beside Ruto, the person who was once his biggest political rival. To the Gen Zs and millennials, he had lost his creed in the political landscape as an opposition leader. In a leaderless movement where no single face was meant to stand for the whole, a few individuals rose to the occasion through sheer conviction and action. Among them, Hanifa Adan became a powerful symbol of what Gen Z was capable of. A young journalist and activist, she was not a politician, but a voice of clarity and courage in a time of chaos. Hanifa's love from the public was earned through her ability to transform online outrage into real-world action. While thousands vented on social media, it was her clear and concise calls to action that helped mobilize people to the streets. He used her platform not for personal fame, but as a critical tool for organization, a digital megaphone that cut through the noise. Her most celebrated contribution was her role in spearheading the Care for the Injured, Mchanga fundraiser. As police violence escalated and protesters were shot, injured, and arrested, it was Hanifa and her network who galvanized the public to raise millions of shillings in a matter of hours. The funds were used to provide medical aid, pay for legal fees. This was a testament to her trustworthiness and integrity, a young woman holding herself accountable to a leaderless movement, in stark contrast to the politicians who had failed them. As the majority leader in the National Assembly, Kimani Ichung'wah was not just a supporter of the finance bill. He was the face of the government's push to pass it. For the young protesters, he was the symbol of a political class that was deaf to their suffering and arrogant in its power.
Mimi nilipiga yes, na niliongoza wabunge 204 wa Kenya kupiga yes.
His role in the most hated category was defined by his unwavering and often unapologetic defense of the proposed taxes. He consistently argued that the bill was necessary for the country's economic stability and dismissed the public's concerns as a lack of understanding. When protests began, he went on the offensive, accusing a few elites of misleading the youth. This condescending rhetoric.
Wale wengi unaona wakiandamana Nairobi, wameshika simu ya iPhone. Wanajiita Gen Z, wanafika kwa maandamano na Uber, wanatoka maandamano wanaingia KFC kukula kuku na minofu. Ama hamkuwaona? Muliwaona? Maji ni ile ya chupa. Hao hawajui kukosa stima ni kitu gani.
Suggesting that the Gen Z protesters were too naive to understand their own economic hardship ignited a firestorm of anger. His position in parliament made him a direct target. When thousands of young people marched to the National Assembly to demand a no vote, they saw Kimani Ichung'wah leading his party to vote yes. This act of defiance in the face of immense public pressure was seen as a profound betrayal. It was an act that made him and the entire political class he represented, a villain in the eyes of the Gen Z generation. The backlash was swift and severe. Online, he was relentlessly trolled. His social media pages flooded with condemnations. Publicly, he was met with scorn and outright hostility. For the youth who had felt ignored by their leaders for too long, Kimani Ichung'wah became the perfect symbol of a system that was fundamentally broken. In their eyes, he was not just a political opponent, but an enemy of the people. After the protests, he attended an Al Jazeera interview hosted by Mehdi Hassan to answer on police brutality, disparity in wealth, and failure of President Ruto's regime to honor its manifesto. He was seen as defiant during the interview to acknowledge that the regime had disturbing metrics only 2 years in office, even after facts and statistics from organizations like the Human Rights Watch. His flashy Christian Louboutin shoes were spotlighted, which highlights the disparity in wealth between politicians and the citizens in Kenya who struggle to afford basic needs. Most comments from Kenyans on the interview video mocked and showed anger towards Kimani Ichung'wah, further proving the hate even long after the infamous Gen Z protests. Entrepreneur and social media personality Khalif Cairo emerged as a powerful figure of the resistance, transforming from a content creator to a trusted voice of the people. Khalif Cairo's love from the Gen Z movement was not because he was a professional activist, but because he was one of them. He was a young businessman who had built his career online, and when the finance bill threatened the livelihoods of his generation, he didn't just post about it. He showed up. He was on the front lines of the protests, using his phone to broadcast live videos that gave his followers an unfiltered view of what was happening on the ground. This authenticity earned him the trust that mainstream media and politicians had lost. Famous for his love to roll with Porsche Cayenne, he is not a poor or average Kenyan by any standard. This proved that the protests against the finance bill were not a battle of the poor against the rich, but Kenyans against the political class. He was even likened to the famous freedom fighter Dedan Kimathi. Later, during another round of protests, this time to march with the State House, Khalif Cairo and other activists like Hanifa Adan urged protesters to abort the mission since it was too risky. This divided the protesters, some claiming that the vocal figures had been brought by the government. However, the likes of Cairo cited it a risky move since the State House is a protected zone, which would result to more lives being lost compared to the parliament storming.
I was in the front line when guys were shot in parliament. I saw that guy get killed. I feel that we would be making a mistake if we went to the streets again tomorrow.
Oscar Sudi, an MP from Kapseret and a staunch, unwavering ally of President William Ruto, Sudi's public persona became the perfect symbol of political arrogance and disconnect. He was one of the first to dismiss the young protesters, initially calling their demonstrations peaceful, but then quickly shifting to warning them against confronting police, urging them to respect authority. His firm loyalty to the president and his defiant rhetoric against the protesters were seen as a blatant disregard for the public suffering.
Mambo yalifanyika Kenya ilikuwa imepangwa. Walikuwa ndaka withdraw government. Hiyo ilikuwa kuu. Walitumia tu watoto wetu kuwaweka mbele na civil societies kupanga hapo na wakora wengine ili wakora wale real wafike.
When the parliament was under siege, Sudi's public "Serikali iko imara" statement was interpreted not as a reassurance but as an act of cold arrogance, a message that the government would not be swayed. The backlash against him was fierce and personal. On 25th June, as protests erupted across the country, a group of demonstrators in Eldoret, Sudi's political stronghold, stormed and vandalized his multi-million shilling club, Timber XO. The act of targeting his personal property was seen by many as a powerful, symbolic act of defiance, a way for the public to show that their anger was not just a political protest, but a direct attack on those who were benefiting from a system they felt had failed them. The incident was widely reported, and while Sudi publicly stated he had forgiven those responsible by withdrawing the charges, the image of his club being ransacked became a defining symbol of protest raw anger. His attempts to justify the government's position were seen not as a political argument, but as a direct betrayal of the hustler ideology that had brought his party to power. While other politicians may have tried to distance themselves from the bill as the protests intensified, Oscar Sudi doubled down. His unwavering support for the president, even as the situation turned deadly, cemented his image as a villain in the eyes of the young protesters.
Si mnajua wale wakora wa mtandao kule Nairobi wanapiga kelele, wanasema sijui Ruto must go, sijui nini. Si mlisikia niliambia hawa jana waruke juu, waende chini, waende kando, hakuna penye Ruto anaenda.
To this day, he is a loyal ally to President Ruto, using hashtags 2-term on his social media posts, a slogan stating Ruto's regime will last for 2 terms, the maximum for a single president under the Kenyan constitution. This is a retaliatory slogan to 1 term, a chant by President Ruto's political force, insisting he will last only for 1 term. On June 25th, the Kenyan parliament was not just physically breached. Its most sacred symbols of authority were hijacked in a series of defiant, anonymous acts. One protester cemented his image as the face of legislative defiance. Having stormed the chamber, this individual climbed into the speaker's chair and delivered the phrase that became the movement's declaration.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I'm here to address you. You must go. Ruto must go. Kwapa, not Wendy.
Another anonymous guy, maybe a protester, was seen wearing a dark ceremonial robe, either the speaker's own official attire or a similar garment belonging to a high-ranking parliamentary officer, like the clerk or sergeant-at-arms. Hijacking this attire signified the usurpation of the highest parliamentary power. His identity remains unknown, transforming him from a person into a powerful symbol of the people's revolt. At the very same moment, the greatest symbolic threat to the state was realized: the removal of the ceremonial mace. The mace, which represents the speaker's and by extension the president's authority, must be present for any parliamentary proceedings to be legal. This act was executed by a separate protester or group of protesters who were filmed triumphantly carrying the golden staff out of the chamber. The mace was later damaged or destroyed, effectively nullifying the day's controversial vote and sending a message that the legislative authority of the state had been rejected. Later reports claimed that the speaker himself cleared the air. The hijacked mace was not the original one. However, these acts were a dangerous test to the government's authority, and a swift reaction was expected. An alleged hijacker of the mace was brought before court, but he denied the charges and was released on a cash bail. Rumors spread afterwards about the whereabouts of these guys, some claiming they were traced by intelligence units and unalived. Larry Madowo, as an international correspondent for the CNN, he had a global platform, and for the Gen Z protesters, this made him both a beacon of truth, making his public perception overwhelmingly positive, and he was widely seen as a hero by the protesters. Unlike local media outlets that were accused of biased or insufficient coverage, Madowo was on the ground, risking his own safety to provide unfiltered, live reports of the police brutality. He was a trusted witness, someone whose reporting could not be controlled by the government. A widely shared video showed a young protester pleading with him, "Larry, ukienda tutauliwa," or "Larry, if you leave, we'll be unalived." A powerful and emotional plea that captured the extent to which he was seen as a protector and a voice for the voiceless. Another viral clip showed him talking with a group of Kenyans seeking refuge from the police, and one cop threw a tear gas canister at them, unprovoked. At this point, as a protector, Madowo had a kind of immunity from the police as a reporter. This made protesters see him as a safety point. He used his privilege and position to highlight the brutality being inflicted on his fellow citizens, cementing his status as a brave and principled journalist. The Holy Family Basilica, a place of sanctuary and worship, found itself not in the middle but on the wrong side of history for a critical moment. For the protesters, who had run to its doors for safety, the basilica became a symbol of institutional betrayal. As police violence escalated, turning the streets of Nairobi into a war zone, hundreds of young protesters ran towards the Holy Family Basilica, hoping for sanctuary. But in a moment of desperate need, the doors of the church remained shut. Tear gas filled the air and police closed in, and a significant number of protesters were allegedly denied entry. This action, whether intentional or not, was a profound shock to a generation that had always been taught that the church was a refuge for the weak and oppressed. The public backlash was immediate. Videos and accounts from the ground spread like wildfire, accusing the church of siding with the government and leaving its people to face brutal force. The trust between the youth and the religious institution was shattered. The church's initial hesitation was interpreted not as a security measure, but as a deliberate act of complicity with a regime that was shooting and gassing its own citizens. While some later reports and church officials will try to clarify the situation, reasoning that its primary concern was the safety and welfare of its students attending the Holy Family Minor Basilica Catholic parochial school located within its compound. For the Gen Z protesters, the damage was already done. In a revolutionary moment that demanded clear moral lines, the Holy Family Basilica was seen as having failed the test. Its place in the narrative of the protest was solidified not as a place of love and sanctuary, but as a painful reminder of how even spiritual institutions can betray the very people they are meant to serve. During one of their functions, one youth audibly declared the basilica's stance, chanting,
Reject the finance bill. Reject the finance bill. Reject the finance bill. Reject the finance bill. Reject the finance bill.
An institution in the same field as the basilica received love in contrast. Jamia Mosque, a beacon of the Muslim faith, found itself on the front lines of the Gen Z protest. On June 20th and 25th, as police violence escalated, Jamia Mosque became a crucial sanctuary for protesters. While some may have expected the mosque to only serve its Muslim community, it opened its doors to all, regardless of faith. This act of humanitarian compassion was widely celebrated. Jamia's compound became a safe zone from tear gas and police harassment, with young people rushing inside to get first aid, water, food, and a moment to catch their breath. The sight of a spiritual institution providing refuge for a secular protest movement was powerful and resonated deeply with the youth. For a few hours, the mosque was not just a place of prayer, but a symbol of solidarity and a lifeline for a besieged generation. However, the mosque's perceived heroism was not without its shadows. Due to its strategic location, Jamia Mosque was often at the epicenter of the protests, leading to direct confrontations with the police. This leads to the next hated group. There were several reports of police firing tear gas canisters directly into the mosque compound, an act that was widely condemned as a sacrilege and a blatant disregard for a place of worship. The Kenyan police hatred was earned through an overwhelming and disproportionate use of force. Across Nairobi and other major cities, protesters were met with batons, tear gas, and most horrifyingly, live ammunition. The goal of the protest was to peacefully petition parliament, but the police tactics turned the streets into a war zone, leaving dozens dead and hundreds more injured. The chilling reports from human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, detailed instances of police using kinetic impact projectiles, rubber bullets, and even live bullets on unarmed civilians. But the brutality did not end with the street clashes. As the protests raged on, the police force was accused of a campaign of abductions and enforced disappearances. Activists, social media influencers, and protest organizers were snatched from their homes and workplaces by individuals in plain clothes, driving unmarked vehicles. These were not random acts. They were a systematic effort to decapitate a leaderless movement. For the youth, this was the ultimate betrayal. The police meant to be guardians of the law had become a tool of a criminal enterprise. Even when police officers were injured, for instance, the cop who badly blew off his arm while trying to lob tear gas canister to protesters, the Gen Zs online commented he deserved it, showing the depth of hatred against the police. Not forgetting at the night hours after the protests, claims were made that the Kenyan police went on a shooting frenzy, and notable areas include Githurai, It's alleged that these massacres were committed during the dark hours and bodies hidden before morning, while others were taken to the morgue with misleading reports on causes of death. On official postmortems, it was revealed gunshot wounds to be the cause of the deaths.
In fact, BBC, on that account, went to investigate in Githurai. And of course, you have read, BBC has said there was no massacre in Githurai.
Mr. President,
there was one person who was shot by the police.
Surprisingly, another security institution received love, the Kenya Defense Forces. When the streets of Nairobi became a battlefield and a state of emergency was declared, a new and unsettling element was added to the conflict: the deployment of the Kenya Defense Forces. For a generation that had lost faith in the police, the military's arrival presented a complex and often contradictory image. President William Ruto's decision to deploy the KDF was an extraordinary and unprecedented move. He declared the protests a security emergency and tasked the military with supporting the police. This decision, however, was met with a starkly different reaction from the public than the one the police had faced. Unlike the police, who were seen as a hated force of oppression, the KDF was widely perceived as a professional, disciplined, and respected institution. On the ground, this perception played out in surprising ways. While the police continued their brutal crackdown, a different scene unfolded where KDF soldiers were present. Photos and videos went viral on social media showing KDF personnel standing guard without engaging in violence. In some instances, they were even seen calming tensions and, in a few notable cases, providing a less aggressive presence than the police. This distinction was not lost on the protesters. A popular narrative emerged online that the KDF were the good guys and the police were the bad guys, with the soldiers being seen as a check on police brutality. For activist Kasmul Makure, aka Kaskazini, what began as a moment of glory quickly descended into a public fall from grace, turning him from a celebrated voice of the protests into one of the most hated figures by the very people he once marched with. His initial rise was meteoric, standing tall amidst the chaos. His articulate and composed interviews became a powerful symbol of the Gen Z movement's maturity and intellect. He was a hero, a young man who declared, "We are not criminals, we are citizens, and we are tired." One notable moment was when he ran from the police into NTV offices at Nation Center along Kimathi Street during the Saba Saba protests. Memes circulated the internet with the clip and Kasmuel's rebellion against the police, who generally were hated for their brutality against protesters, cemented him at the heart of the Gen Zs as a loved demonstration figure. But his fame soon came with friction. The Gen Z movement was fiercely against any form of designated leadership, believing a single leader could be easily corrupted. This core principle was what led to his downfall. Just weeks after the protests, photos began to circulate of Kasmuel in meetings with established politicians, some linked to the very government he had publicly criticized. The backlash was immediate and brutal. The word sellout trended online, and many of his former supporters accused him of abandoning the leaderless spirit of the movement for personal gain. His attempts to justify his meetings as strategy were widely rejected as a flimsy excuse. The hatred became so intense that it followed him to subsequent protests. During a separate anti-femicide march in Nairobi, he was met with a hostile reception. Video clips went viral of protesters booing him, shouting, "Rudi home, enda!" This public rejection solidified the narrative that he had betrayed the movement. Shadrach Khalif, a young activist and a voice for the Gen Z cause, he was not a politician, but a citizen whose courage earned him a terrifying ordeal.
Final message. We are going to make you the first and only one-term president of the Republic of Kenya. Be ready. We are sending you home in 2027 and you will never step into country politics. Mr. William Samoei Ruto, receive our message. Thank you very much, sir.
Shadrach was on the front lines, using his social media platform to amplify the voices of his generation. He was praised for his activism and his presence in the streets as the protests intensified. He was one of the planners of the successful Occupy Parliament protests on June 18. Kiprono came into the limelight on Monday, June 17, when he was seen distributing placards and flyers in the streets of Nairobi to aid in the anti-finance bill protests. In a street interview with the press, Chad invited all Kenyans to show up for the demonstrations, adding that he is not an activist, but the government had forced him to walk in the streets and urge people to come out and fight for their rights. But his newfound prominence came at a grave cost, as the government's response turned from policing to a campaign of enforced disappearances. Shadrach became a target. In the days following the protests that saw Parliament occupied, he was abducted in South B area, with human rights organizations and activists raising an alarm over his disappearance. His abduction sent a chilling message to the entire Gen Z movement. If a peaceful protester could be taken off the street in broad daylight, then no one was safe. The public outcry over his disappearance was immense, turning him into a symbol of the government's brutality and the lengths it would go to silence dissent. His name became a rallying cry, a powerful reminder of what the young people were risking in their fight for justice. When he was eventually released, Shadrach's story of survival became a source of both heartbreak and inspiration. He became a living example of the personal toll of political resistance, his story reminding everyone that the fight for freedom was not without its cost. Let's not forget all the lives lost during the protests. The Gen Z protests forever changed the landscape of Kenyan politics. They created a new kind of political currency, where a single tweet could carry more weight than a speech in parliament, and where a leaderless movement could hold the most powerful to account. The revolution had no leader, but it had a powerful message. The old rules were gone. Like, subscribe, and watch this awesome video next.